Hi class, welcome back. Today we have an unusual lecture in the sense that we are going to take a time out and talk about wetland restoration. Now, most of the course we've been referring to ecosystem restoration because what we're teaching is applicable to any ecosystem. But if you're working in the ground course on a group project, you're probably going to be doing wetland restoration. So I want to take a moment and just cover some foundational concepts around wetland restoration, make sure you all are comfortable with them. So the source for this knowledge is primarily straight out of the Beginner's Guide to Wetland Restoration, which I'll make available. And this is put out by the Greater Wellington Regional Council. So even though this is out of New Zealand, it's really applicable to wetland restoration here in the States as well. All right, it's worth mentioning or reiterating why wetlands are so important. First off, they act as a giant sponge, so they slow water down. If you have a highly erosive environment like we do here on the Palouse with lots of sediments running downhill with a heavy rain, wetlands help to slow that material down. Sediments drop out, the nutrients build up in a wetland environment, and vegetation then filters that water so that the water leaving the wetland is cleaner than the water entering a wetland. And you frequently see wetlands employed as such, as filters, either as part of a sewage treatment plant or even in someone's home. I've seen systems in South Asia that are individualized to someone's home where gray water coming out of their sinks and out of their wastewater system goes through a tiered series of wetlands, and then they reuse it on the other side. So wetlands are incredibly effective and certainly very cost effective compared to expensive systems that require a lot of technology and electricity. Wetlands are also a very, very important food source. They're incredibly productive. So the plants that grow in wetlands tend to put on a lot of growth seasonally, and they provide the fuel for a lot of insects. Those insects provide food for fishes and frogs and birds. So wetlands tend to be a real hotspot of biological activity. And they tend to be very interesting ecosystems to study because they provide that primary production. They are a great food source. You know, wetlands are also a cultural treasure. So very frequently, indigenous societies relied on wetlands at least part of the year to provide a lot of their food and raw materials. And that's certainly true here in the US as well. Okay, it's worth mentioning that there are lots of kinds of wetlands. We can categorize them any number of ways. So this is not an official classification. If you want to get into more detail about how to classify wetlands, that's a whole course unto itself. Usually has to do with the soils and the movement of water. But these are some generic classifications that I find useful. So bogs. Bogs are very unusual environments. It's usually a low spot that collects water and has very acidic soil and water. And they can host some very unusual plants and animals because of that acidity. Bogs are even commercially important. Most cranberries in the US are produced in bogs. So they're fascinating environments, although they're not terribly common. Coastal wetlands are some of the most productive in the world, and these include salt marshes. So you should be able to distinguish between a marsh and a swamp. So a marsh is just a wet area. It's a wetland that is dominated by grasses. So tall grasses and reeds. And these marshes are incredibly rich in animal life, especially along the coast where you have a mixing of fresh water and salt water. That sets up a spectacularly productive ecosystem um, because of the mixing of nutrients and just the biogeochemistry of the site. A lot of our fish that we eat, at least some portion of their life history, is inside a coastal wetland. This is even true of shrimp. So they're very, very important, and unfortunately, they're being lost at an alarming rate due to coastal development and sea level rise, among other activities. All right, swamps. Swamps are wetlands, but they're forested. So again, marshes have grasses, swamps are very similar, and they can also be coastal like mangroves, but they are forested. And so you have a different structural makeup for these wetlands. And they may host different types of species, but they're also really important. The thing they have in common, of course, is that water levels fluctuate, and that the trees that live there have to be accustomed to those fluctuating waters. Now, with all wetlands, there may be a time of year where they're dry. And that's what people forget, is that the wetland environment is incredibly dynamic, especially in terms of the hydrology. And you would think that that drying out would be harmful to the wetland, but in fact, the coming and going of water is what facilitates that explosive growth. So it's actually quite important for some types of wetlands to dry out seasonally. Otherwise, the plants there may not be able to cope, and the environment would look quite different. Okay, lakes and ponds. These are water bodies, but very frequently they have fringes of wetland or submerged vegetation around the perimeter. So lakes and ponds can also offer important wetland characteristics. So this is a schematic of wetland area in New Zealand and total New Zealand bird species. And you can see that wetland area is a tiny fraction of the New Zealand landscape. It's 2% of the landscape. Most of New Zealand is mountains. However, that tiny 2% of land that is wet hosts 22% of the native wetland birds. So wetlands all over the world offer an outsized importance to local wildlife. And they may be residential wildlife that lives there year-round, or they may be migratory wildlife. Wetlands are incredibly important pit stops for all kind of migrating animals, be them birds or antelope or you name it, really. So unfortunately, wetlands have been largely diminished on the landscape, and that diminishment is a large reason why we've seen many native populations of wildlife reduced as well. This is kind of a nice workflow in terms of restoring a wetland. In general, you want to keep it as simple as possible. Wetlands are very subtle habitats. The elevation change is very subtle. And you don't want to make things too complicated. You want it to be self-sustaining. You want it to take care of itself after you leave. But I find that this workflow is a nice review of what we've talked about in this course already, and it is specific to wetlands. So let's have a look. So initially you want to look, learn, and plan. You want to think about the wetland type and what you think you can achieve at that particular location. Can you really restore what was there historically, or are you trying to establish a new functional wetland type? Then you're going to investigate its water supply, and you need to understand if there's too little or too much water coming to the site and how that needs to be manipulated to achieve a more natural balance. So start with the water. Next, you may be wanting to keep stock out. So a lot of wetlands and springs and lakes and ponds and you name it. All these habitats are pretty fragile, especially when exposed to cattle and horses and large domestic animals. Um, so you may be interested in keeping out that kind of stock at least part of the year so as not to disrupt native plants and bird nesting, etc. Next, as you follow this workflow, you might want to do any of the following. You might want to tackle weeds. That's a very common concern. You might want to control animal pests. We'll talk about that more in a minute. And you might want to provide extras. So by extras, I mean, let's say you've restored some of the vegetation, you've restored the water to the site. Well, you might want to go a step further and provide some snags for nesting owls or something like that, or provide viewing platforms for people who want to experience the site. Those are things that I consider extras, that if you have the funding, you should do everything you possibly can to improve that habitat and improve people's experience and appreciation of it. Okay, next, as we move along this workflow, once all that rest of that stuff is taken care of, then you can put your native plants in. And you're going to want to maintain them with weed control and pest control. A lot of times people will install native plants and just kind of walk away. And those native plants and the investment gets squandered because the weeds outpace them and they become choked with non-natives. So very frequently it's important to do at least some degree of aftercare where you're weeding and watering to make sure that you give those native plants a head start. That brings us to monitoring your progress, making sure that you were successful, and then installing some protection of your investment. So this might be working out with a local conservation group who's going to take care of the site in perpetuity. It might mean controlling access to the site so it doesn't get damaged. That could mean any number of things. But it is important to be thinking ahead about how you're going to protect your investment in that place. So this is an important point. No two wetlands are alike. Even if they're the same wetland type, let's say you're working on a coastal marsh. A coastal marsh in one location can be radically different than a coastal marsh 5 miles away. So they're highly individualized according to the soils and according to the water and its movement across that landscape. So you want to make sure that you observe these places carefully, that you collect data, that you're very sober about what's possible there and what isn't. So these are the types of questions you should be asking yourself before you even get started. What is there now? Is there any native community there that you want to protect? Or is it all invasives at this stage? So you really need to inventory what's on site, as you know. What was there originally, if there are any records? What would you like to see in the future? What are your goals? Be it erosion control, wildlife, water supply, etc. How much time and resources do you have? So really understanding your capacity to do this work and what's realistic. And then here's an important one. What effect are your activities going to have on neighboring properties, both upstream and downstream? So you want to be thinking about folks who live nearby and their perceptions of the project, their boundaries with the project. You want to make sure that you're incorporating them into the planning as well. In thinking about water supply, you have to assess whether the wetland needs year-round water supply or seasonal water supply, or is this a wetland that's only going to receive water ephemerally every now and then? There are plenty of important wetlands that only get wet once every few years. So thinking about the frequency of water and the duration of water and the level of water on the site is very important. Remember that wetlands fluctuate naturally with precipitation. And you want to do your best to understand the appropriate hydrology to a site before you manipulate it. And sometimes this even means thinking about groundwater. So some wetlands are fed by springs and groundwater. And if you're trying to restore a site like that, and the neighboring properties have all tapped the groundwater with their wells, well, you may not have enough water to work with. So it may not be feasible. So these are some of the considerations in terms of the hydrology. Now, creating areas of open water is problematic. So let's imagine you want to create a lake and you want nice vegetation, wetland vegetation around the periphery, and then you want some open water habitat in the middle. Maybe it's because you're trying to attract diving ducks, or you're trying to stock it with deep water fish. This is just an area of wetland restoration that requires a little bit more care, because open water can sometimes fill up with weeds and algae, especially with warm temperatures in the summer, and you need to be aware of that. And sometimes the elevations required to fine-tune the wetland are pretty tricky for maintaining good water quality. So weeds, you can keep them at bay if the pond or lake is not receiving too much in the way of nutrients. So if there's no fertilizer runoff, things like that, then you'll probably be more successful than if you were working on a property with lots of nutrient inputs, and then you're going to have explosive weed problems. In any case, I just want to bring this to your attention. Refer back to this document if you have concerns like that as you're designing a project. I mentioned extras for birds or extras for wildlife in general. Sometimes this means leaving dead trees on site that provide perching sites and nesting sites. It really could be anything. It could be a buffer even around the site with a hedgerow, and maybe that provides good habitat for songbirds. Or maybe you're creating a corridor of wetlands, allowing wildlife to move across the landscape. There's any number of extras, quote unquote, that are worth considering beyond just the small wetland site itself. Fish, of course, have needs as well, and primarily, usually, they need good shade from overhanging vegetation. They need places to hide, so they need complex aquatic habitat with lots of logs and things in it to provide structure to hide from predators. And you might need to even consider like flow speed. So if you have a stream entering or exiting a wetland, you may need to consider how fast that water is moving. There's a whole bunch of considerations that are very specific to fish. And I'm not going to get into that except to say it's important to have a fish biologist on your team if you are trying to restore a wetland for fish. Again, teamwork is everything in project management, and each project requires a different team, so you can select from different areas of expertise depending on the problem at hand. Okay, your textbook and this document here do a pretty good job of talking about the specific needs of vegetation with respect to wetland restoration. Planting plans, you've seen these before, they're very important. And planting plans will usually break the site into zones. Zones where you have plants that require moist soils that don't flood very frequently. Plants that require wet soils that are temporarily or seasonally flooded. And then those plants, of course, that like to have their feet wet, that like to live in the water most of the year. So this is where having a really good baseline map with topographic elevations will help you in determining the best strategy for planting. It's not just what to plant, of course, it's when to plant and how to prepare the site. So you might need to spray herbicide, you may need to solarize a site to clear it of invasive weeds, or at least most of the weeds, and the seed bank of those weeds. And then you might need to plant a certain time of year to make sure that the seedlings or the seed stock gets the water it needs to get a good healthy start. Each site is going to be different. When planting, it's not as easy as sticking it in the ground. Often there are specific things that you need to do, like digging the proper size hole to allow for root expansion, making sure you're planting in the appropriate places, as we mentioned before, and really thinking hard about uh, what's required of these plants to give them a good start. The first 6 months is really crucial. And one last thing is protecting the plants. So from grazers. So grazers can include anything from deer and elk to beaver. And it's amazing how quickly your seedlings can vanish on you, and then you're in a position of having to start over and spend more money. So very frequently the first few years, restoration sites look a little silly because you're putting cages around the plants, or maybe even fences around plant communities that are especially important. But all of that can be removed and should be removed later once the plants are properly established. Okay, a note about animal pests. This is not so much a problem around here, but periodically you might work in an environment where you have highly invasive animals that are going to represent a problem to your vegetative uh, restoration. So an example I'm real familiar with is nutria. Along the Gulf Coast, this is a distant cousin of the muskrat. It's basically a rapidly reproducing, swimming rodent, and they're really good at devouring the roots of various wetland plants and digging holes in dikes and levees and berms, and they can be fairly destructive to new wetland restoration projects. So that's an example where it might be worthwhile having a professional like trap them out and relocate them to another location where they'll do less harm. Now, your textbook has a whole chapter on weed control, and I am not going to go into that in great detail, but if you suspect that this is going to be part of your profession, then I really encourage you to spend some extra time with that chapter, because I did find it really helpful personally. All right, that's it for today. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a primer on wetland restoration, and you'll be able to use that going forward in our projects. Thank you so much.